Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of the Prospect Podcast. My name is Benjamin Clark and I'm joined by Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis was Greek finance minister during the Eurozone crisis, and he has since remained an active politician, activist, commentator, and a prolific author, including of his new book, Raise Your Soul, which we'll be discussing today. Now, Yanis, your book covers the history of Greece through the eyes of 5 women in your extended family. At a time when, to quote Mark Zuckerberg, masculine energy is increasingly dominant in the public sphere at the moment. This could be considered your first overtly feminist book. How did you go about, approaching this task as a man, writing about these 5 women in your family, and why now?
Well, it's the only book that I didn't explicitly write to follow some political agenda. Because even when I wrote a science fiction book, it was a political agenda. I wanted to put forward some political thesis. I'm a political animal. I have to admit that. And that's how I wrote every book. This one was very different. So my brief history of capitalism was addressed to my daughter, talking to my daughter, it was called, and it was like a long letter to my daughter. The techno-feudalism book was addressed to my dad, to my father who had just died. And when I finished writing that book, that long letter to my dad, I started feeling extremely remorseful. Because yes, my father was a very significant person in my life and blah, blah, blah. But I thought to myself, where's my mom? My mother was my political mentor, not my dad. My dad was an important person and all that, but he was not the person who shaped me politically as a political animal that I am. It was my mom. I was going through a low period. There was the war in Ukraine, the genocide in Palestine, the political defeats that my party and me personally suffered here, like all the leftists I know and centrists. We are, being demolished by this manosphere, by the Trumpism, by the ultra-right wing, the xenophobia and so on. And I have to say that for the first time in my life, I started feeling the weight of these defeats and that depression on my shoulders. And when I get depressed, I write. So I thought, okay, I haven't spoken about my mother ever, outside the very small social circle, family circle. So I started recounting the first memory I have of my mother shaping me ethically and politically. It's a scene in 1970 with which the book begins when she's heavily pregnant with my sister, and she takes me in a taxi to visit my uncle, her brother, my favorite uncle, who had just been tortured. He was incarcerated during the fascist dictatorship we had here in Greece in 1970. But then I moved away from my own predicament, talking about the way in which I was shaped by these women, my mother directly and my grandmom indirectly. And then I realized that what the text that I had in my hands was not about Greece. It wasn't even about Egypt, because my grandmother was born, raised, and lived and died in Egypt. So it wasn't just about Greece. It was more like a story of what had happened the last 100 years in the West, in the Near East, in the Middle East. It was a universal story. It was turning out. It was never intended to be a feminist history. It ended up being a feminist history. And, I need to be nuanced about that, because I'm not sure that a man can write a feminist history. If a feminist turns around and says to me, a feminist woman turns around and says to me that, feminism needs to be embodied through a woman's body, I will throw my hands up and surrender and say, yes, you're right. I don't even know whether I have the right to appropriate the voices of women. But then again, these women would simply be lost into oblivion if I didn't write their stories. So if I didn't tell those stories, nobody would.
And interesting. And so just to move to another relative of yours, you mentioned your uncle, but another male relative of yours, he was somewhat sympathetic to the far right. He even sympathized with Nazi Germany at one point in his life, but then later took up, violent resistance against the military regime in Greece. So I guess bringing it forward to today and thinking about young men today, there are many young men who are, finding themselves sympathetic to the far right of politics in various countries. Can these young men be persuaded and change their mind? And if so, how?
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. Nobody should be left behind. I'm not prepared to surrender any young person, especially young person, not even older people, to the fascists. If you think in your country, remember a few weeks ago, what was it, months ago, there was this Tommy Robinson inspired demonstration. Where was it? In Trafalgar Square, in the city of London, in the center of London. There were 150,000, 160,000. Now, how many of them were fascists? Very few. Most of them were angry people, deluded people, people who felt the need to express themselves through shouting and screaming and carrying a flag. I'm not prepared to let any one of those go without not a condescending conversation with them, but listening to them, finding out what motivates them. And if you give the time of day to people, you'll find that nobody's a lost cause. Fascism is not predetermined to win them over. But it's important that we ditch the George W. Bush theory that, if you're not with me, you're against me. This kind of toxic dichotomy that, there is us and there is them. And we stay within our bubble and we pat each other on the back within our bubble, and we hate those who are in another bubble. So that's what these women taught me, my mother in particular, but not also only my mother, her mother as well, who raised me in an important way because my mother was at work most days when I was a kid. They taught me how to recognize the multidimensional aspects of a person. So the way I narrate this man that you mentioned, my mother's brother, why should we care about him? Why should anyone care about him? I mean, I knew him, but why should you care about him? Or any of my readers care about him? Well, because he's the epitome of the complexity of males, of the defective sex like me. You can have somebody like him demonstrate the worst and the best in humanity. And he can be a cad and at the same time be heroic. He can be absolutely regressive and disgustingly patriarchal, and at the same time, a sweetie pie. So this is what my mother taught me. Not to be relativist, to say, everybody's everything. No. You've got to fight him when he's being a cad. And you've got to take him to task when he's lured to fascism or to racism or to whatever. And at the same time, you have to appreciate his qualities. Now, if we can imagine doing this in the political sphere, I think humanity has a chance.
Yeah, interesting. So moving to another section of your book, I was struck by the depictions in it of government suppression of dissent. You even detail instances in which you yourself were physically attacked for your political views. I mean, I couldn't help but draw some parallels to what we're seeing in the US and the UK at the moment with some of the crackdowns on protesters and some of the ways in which protest has been suppressed. How would you explain the sort of upsurge of governments suppressing activism today under both right-wing governments in the US, for instance, but also centre-left governments like here in the UK?
Every regime that is feeling insecure, whether it is dictatorial or indeed bourgeois liberal, is prone to authoritarianism. They don't go straight for the gulag. They don't just build the gulag initially, but it's a steady decline in that direction. So the figure of my uncle Panagis, for instance, whom we discussed very briefly before, I remember when he was defending liberalism from a right-wing perspective, from a centrist perspective, he was saying that sometimes liberalism needs to protect itself through illiberal means. So, if we need to put people in jail even without trial to save the Constitution, this is what we must do. And, suddenly you have somebody like Keir Starmer using anti-terrorism legislation in order to proscribe, um, an organization which sprayed some paint on aeroplanes in a military base. And you have this, a prime minister who made his career as a human rights lawyer, violating the most basic liberal principles which he made a career out of defending. And once you are down that slippery slope, the more authoritarian you become, the greater the stagnation and the fragmentation of your regime, the more you panic, the greater the authoritarianism that you go deeper into authoritarianism, and that is a doom loop. And before you know it, you've lost your country. Before you know it, you've lost liberalism. Before you know it, you end up in the preposterous situation. Remember, during the coronation of King Charles, there was this gentleman standing in front of the House of Commons with a blank piece of paper. He was demonstrating with a blank. It didn't say anything. And he was arrested for offending the king. Now, I lived in Britain between 1978 and 1988. There were difficult years. Thatcher was reigning supreme. She was making the place unlivable from my perspective, right? There was, the troubles were raging. You had Bobby Sands dying of starvation in the Maze prison in Northern Ireland. There were turbulent times. But back then, even though there were turbulent times, and you had very right-wing people in government, and you had, the police were extremely brutal the way they attacked us when we were picketing at Wapping or before that during the miners' strike. I've seen scenes in Britain where the police was acting like an occupation army. And nevertheless, even Thatcher and the Thatcherites, who you can't get more right-wing than that. You move to Genghis Khan territory, right? They would never have imagined of imprisoning a man with a blank piece of paper. Or they would never have imagined of putting me in prison because I was supporting political rights for the IRA terrorists who were being held in the Maze prison. Today, Keir Starmer would have proscribed me as a terrorist.
Yeah, interesting. And so, in this section of the book where you speak about Britain, you make an analogy, I guess, between your experiences in Greece and in Britain, and you have this line where you said that if Britain's ruling class was ever seriously threatened, its own secret police would be deployed. And I was wondering, what do you mean by that? Are you referring to a possible future scenario in that regard, or are you referring to basically what's happening today with the sort of crackdowns on protesters, etc.?
Well, I think it's both. By the way, that wasn't my line. I was very young. I was only 17, 18. I had just enrolled at the University of Essex as a student, and I was participating in the picket line in Dagenham. That was the main factory of Ford Motor Company. And after a very miserable day on the picket line, soaked, cold, just dead tired, we were at the pub, and I was sitting next to an old Scottish miner, a leader, one of the greats of the NUM, the National Union of Mine Workers, Mick McGaughey, a very well-known figure back then. And at some point, everybody was complaining about the government, about the bosses, about retrenchments, and the brutality of the police, the picket lines. And I turned around and said, but at least, referring to my own experiences when I was 7 years old, the secret police broke down our front door, and abducted my father. Abducted, not arrested, abducted my father, right? With a black hood on his head for absolutely nothing, except that his name was on a list of the usual suspects. And I said to Mick, yeah, but at least in this country, Mick, you can go to bed at night without fearing the secret police breaking down your door and abducting you. And he said, oh, beware, my my boy, because, even in this country, if the regime feels threatened, then the secret police would do exactly that. And, years later, a couple of years later, I found out that indeed this man had a tail, an MI5 tail, and there was a long campaign to discredit him. And it was just Mick McGaughey. It was even, Harold Wilson, the prime minister, that was being tailed and sabotaged to some extent by MI5. These are well-known facts now. I mean, it is common knowledge. So you never know when you will lose your country, Benjamin. You never know. My uncle, who was a center rightist, never imagined that his own people, this is what he considered the police to be and the security service, his own people on the side of the Constitution of liberalism, would, on the night of the 21st of April, 1967, they would disband Parliament and suspend the Constitution and, open the prison gates for anyone they, didn't take a shine to. You never know. You should never take anything for granted. And this is the reason why I mentioned this example with a man standing in front of the House of Commons with a blank piece of paper. If this man is incarcerated, no one is safe.
Yeah, interesting. So, thinking about this period in your life, there was one particular thing that jumped out in the book to me. You ended up the president of the Essex Black Students Association. Could you?
Never the president.
Sorry. Yes, spokesman. There you go.
Black Students Alliance, the BSA, a wonderful organization.
Yeah. Could you explain to us how you ended up in that position, Yanis?
Well, it started at the pub. Where else? The Union Bar, right? I was there with friends we were all leftists. Some of us were Greeks, others were Brits, others were Afro-Caribbean, Jamaicans, and so on. And there were 3 or 4 guys from Jamaica who were the heart and soul of the BSA, the Black Students Alliance. And at some point they said to me, "We have an idea. Would you like to be our spokesperson in the next Students' Union Assembly?" And I said, "Are you serious? Don't you have enough blood in your alcohol? What are you going on about? Have you seen me?" He said, "Well, this is precisely the reason." One of them said, Winston was his name. He said, "We want to make the point that black is not a biological issue, that it's a state of mind, and it is a social and colonial issue." So the whole point was, because I wasn't black, they selected me, they asked me. And I said, "Well, what do you say?" "Look, it doesn't matter. All you have to do is get up and speak on behalf of the Black Students Alliance. And when people start laughing and throwing things at you, which was the whole point of me getting up to speak for the Black Students Alliance and to say, we blacks, right? The moment they start throwing things at you, which is what we want, you turn around and you say, come, comrades, friends, fellow students, black is a state of mind. We Greeks are the blacks of Europe." And then it so happened that there were some Irish blokes and girls under there. They said, "We are also the blacks of Britain." And the point was made. And from that, but it just goes to show, Benjamin, also that how different the times are, because this was 1978, 79. Today, this would bring upon me very serious charges of cultural appropriation. But of course, it would be right to be charged with cultural appropriation if it wasn't for the fact that it was the black students that asked me to do it in order to make a point. But I lament the fact that today we probably wouldn't experience that kind of debate where, whether you're black or not is considered a state of mind. Now, the toxicity of identity politics is such that we're missing the plot. And we missed that togetherness, because in that pub, we had a togetherness. It didn't matter whether your eyes Greek, black, Jamaican. And we were in it together. We had that spirit of fighting together for an end to all sorts of different patterns of discrimination. That is gone now. And that's something I would very much like to see coming back before I die.
So you're talking about the US there, and I guess we've spoken about Labor and Keir Starmer here in the UK being in not the best of ways, but I guess the Democrats are not doing too well either at the moment. However, there is a great hope that has appeared on the scene, and that is Zohran Mamdani, who has lit up the stage there in a rather bleak context. The mayoral election in New York is in a few days' time. So by the time people are listening to this interview or reading it, it'll have taken place. But what do you make of the Mamdani phenomenon, and what advice would you give to the Democrats at the moment in the US?
Well, truth be told, and for the purposes of full disclosure, I have endorsed and supported Mamdani many months ago. So I'm not unbiased. I wish him best of luck. I think that, look, people call him a communist, a socialist. I'm a socialist. Somebody can even call me a communist, a kind of strange libertarian communist. But nevertheless, I'm happy to accept that label. I don't think he is. I think what he's doing is he's reviving the long tradition, or the long lost tradition, of Franklin Roosevelt. It was Roosevelt that introduced works programs, free buses, rent controls, social security, food stamps. Yeah, I mean, this was the tradition that made America great, not Trump. And he's bringing it back to New York. Now, is he going to be able to enact any of that? He very rightly, he points to the very low minimum wage in New York, given the cost of living. And he wants to bring it up to $30 an hour. But he can't do that without the support of the state assembly, which he doesn't control. So the question is, yes, like Bernie Sanders back in 2015, 2016, this kind of democratic socialist agenda in the United States has a lot of room to create huge support. The Democratic Party is the one that constantly tries to put a lid on it, because they preferred Donald Trump to Bernie Sanders. They did everything in their power to make sure that Bernie Sanders would not be president, even if that meant Donald Trump would be president, the way they supported Hillary Clinton, a lame horse. And they're doing the same thing with Cuomo now. They would much rather see Cuomo. Everybody knows what Cuomo is, but they don't care. They just don't want any kind of redistribution from the oligarchy to the people who, if they receive some of this financial support, they will do a lot of good with it. So that's what we see now in the United States. We saw it in Britain. We saw a Labour Party establishment that was much keener to see Boris Johnson win the election than Jeremy Corbyn. And the result is, of course, in the end, it's not even the Boris Johnsons and the Donald Trumps that benefit in the long run. It's the fascists and the authoritarians.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.